So effectively, the politics behind the situation is very similar to today. A lot of it is hidden. You don't really see it. And you really got to dig to find out. So I'm going to start this off because the real thing where the Cape became important was because of the Industrial Revolution, which was increasing production in the world, but it also at the same time led to unemployment and discontent amongst the populace. The American War of Independence, which came in because they were very unhappy with paying taxes but not being able to benefit as much as what they should. So they wanted a new form of government which was free of Britain, and that got democracy and a thing known as patriotism going. But when the war started, although America was partially industrialized, it was not sufficient. So it had to get arms from France initially, and when the British then started to stop France, they then organized through Holland to ship armaments to the States by that. And then Britain, to stop this, first declared war on France, and then obviously they declared war on Holland. And it was the first time that the British politicians really faced patriotism, and they did not like the idea of patriotism. So sorry, I must move on here to give you the next slide. I've just put this up. It's an 1850 slide, so it's a bit later than usual, but this is where all the schemes were planned. You can see there's Big Ben, which is Westminster, is round about here. So all of the planning was done in this particular area. They then, in order to go along, they had a gentleman by the name of George Johnson. And George Johnson was the advisor to the North Cabinet. And they developed a project known as the South Seas Project in the 1600s, which was to take the colonies that Spain had in South America. But obviously it was difficult. They couldn't do it. So when Spain, which was also involved in the American War of Independence, declared war on Britain in 1779, it was the first thing that Britain decided to do was to resurrect the South Seas Project. And Johnson was given instructions to do it. The problem was that these were secret instructions, and his force was the only force that was given these instructions. So on the 19th of December, 1780, when Holland had joined the First League of Armed Neutrality, Britain declared war on Holland the next day. The South Seas Project was cancelled, and a secret expedition to take the Cape was ordered. Now, at this point in time, Britain realized the importance of the Cape to her. So they changed the South Seas Project and moved it on to go onto the Cape. Now, what had happened was that there was a lot of spying activity going on, in particularly against Johnson's expedition. And they wanted to find out what it was, what he was doing, where he was going. But they knew what he had in terms of ships, but they never knew what his mission's objective really was. The English caught a spy by the name of Francis Delamotte. And Delamotte, long after everything had happened, his trial revealed how the French were obtaining the intelligence on the British shipping. But the thing that was happening while this intelligence was going through was that whilst Johnson was getting ready, the French Navy had built up an equally sized naval force. So they kept pace. If the British added a ship, they added a ship. But the most important thing was that they decided they would take two regiments with them to reinforce the Cape garrison. And the French commander was Admiral Suffren. What then happened was Johnson left a little 9 days before Suffren from Europe, but obviously where France left from Brest, it was far closer, so he was only a few days behind. But the English did get to Santiago Island, which is in the Cape Verde, and there the two fleets met on the 16th of April 1781. Both fleets were severely damaged in the engagement, so much so that they had to first repair. Johnson decided to repair his ships at Porto Praya while Suffren continued to the Cape, and he arrived there just in time to reinforce the VOC garrison. Thus, Johnson's expedition failed. It didn't quite meet what it should have met. But there were lessons that they had to learn. And the lessons that were learned in this is political side now, was that the EEIC, the English East India Company, was changed, the method of control, because they realized that some of the secrets have been let out via the EEIC, and they formed what they call the Secret Committee. And this Secret Committee played a heavy role in all of the things that happened at the Cape thereafter. The English had three very important politicians, and all three of these men were basically in power over the full time from 1784 all the way through to 1806. So they were the ones who realized just exactly what the importance was to Britain having the Cape in their possession. So the first one was William Pitt, the younger, Henry Dundas, who was later known as Lord Melville, and finally Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh. These three men were very instrumental in knowing what was involved, and they, through the whole period, went through. So after the American War of Independence, a new thing appeared for England, and that was the one thing that the USA had learned was how to build ships. And they, of course, had all the forests and everything else that they needed. So they started to compete with America in terms of the shipping. And this was quite intriguing in that they had a huge advantage. The first one was that their ships were not as heavily armed as the British ships. They carried a smaller crew. And then what they did do, which was for them a brilliant idea, was that they relied on French and English maintaining the trade presence in India or in the Amboina and Banda, the Spice Islands. So they did not have to maintain this, and it was a huge advantage. And obviously the EIC could not compete with them. It was just impossible. So what was happening was that America was shipping goods to the USA and to the world cheaper than what the English could do. So the English idea to get around this problem was in fact to start having trade agreements. And these trade agreements were first easily bypassed by the Americans. What they did was they would build a ship in America and then sail that ship to the east. And whilst that ship was in transit or before, it was sold to an English buyer. But the ownership was retained by the American builders. The ship's captain would then purchase a cargo and return to the USA or West Indies, and the ship was then transferred to an English buyer who could then legally take the cargo and everything and sail to England and sell it there. So they managed to bypass the trade agreement. The second method was for an American ship to go to the east, collect the cargo, and then come back and sell the cargo in a neutral port, the goods. And again, the English buyer then could take them to England comfortably. So America easily broke any trade agreements they had. The next problem that the Americans had was that they were already industrialized or semi-industrialized. And one of the main things that America had was it had extensive forests all over the place. And what happened was England, instead of shipping the wood to Britain and building a ship there, rather built the ship in America. So in some ways, they established a shipbuilding industry. And it was established along the entire 1,000-mile coastline of the then USA, which consisted of 13 provinces. But the problem was that after the war, Britain had absolutely no idea how big this shipbuilding industry was. So they were petrified of it. They didn't know. But their main concern was that America could build warships for France and Holland, and thus the Americans could easily outpace British warship production. And obviously this, for a country which is dependent on naval superiority, it would be an absolute disaster. So they needed to gain control. And the only way that they realized that they could do this was to take the Cape. But they couldn't, because they were not at war with Holland at that period of time. So it was a bit difficult for them. They did try more trade agreements, but that didn't work either. The trouble was that in Holland, the patriotism had somehow from the Americans gone to Holland first. And the reason was that America was looking for finance from Holland. So this idea of patriotism rose in Holland first, but it wasn't as violent as the French Revolution. It was far less, but nevertheless, it did lead to a lot of problems. And because the people realized that this was a new system and they were looking for it. And it was known as the Velvet Revolution because obviously it wasn't as explosive. But what Britain then tried to do was to enter into a friendship alliance with Holland, because what they needed to do was to boost the stadtholder, the Prince of Orange, and reduce the patriotism which was on the rise. But one of the things that they wanted to do in this friendship alliance was that they proposed that they send British troops to reinforce the Cape. So obviously in doing this, they would then be able to hold the Cape against any French aggression. But the French Revolution changed everything. And it led shortly afterwards, 3 or 4 years later, it led to the French Revolutionary War. And during this war, Britain lost her ally Holland. But before it collapsed, there were frantic efforts made by the VOC secretary, from the VOC Secretary Fargel, to obtain every single piece of information that they could on the Cape, because they had very little. They realized they knew nothing about the Cape at all. So they only had a few plans and a few bits and pieces. But they were at that point, while this negotiation was going on, they were already planning to send a squadron down to the Cape, but they needed now to move fast. Not like Johnson's expedition, they needed to keep it quiet. And at the same time, they needed to get to the VOC, to get to the Cape first, where they could stop a French landing and they could reinforce the VOC garrison. So a second larger military force was assembled in England for a follow-on invasion if necessary. I just was doing this. Is the problem with the French Revolution, which I didn't talk too much about, was that the people were taxed to hell, and obviously they weren't very happy with it. And this is a cartoon that came out during the French Revolution of two poor people trying to chop the head of the tax monster. They obviously were not successful. Anyway, the VOC at that point in 1795 was on the verge of economic collapse. With large Xhosa tribes on the eastern frontier, it placed a burden on the local burghers who were forced to defend themselves. And these burghers in turn rebelled against any authority, which only exacerbated the problem for the VOC. Britain arrived, they obviously arrived in the Cape somewhere in June, the 11th of June, I think it was, 1795, where they then had the Battle of Muizenberg on the 7th of August, because Britain was trying, where possible, to take the Cape via guile. In other words, they were trying to get the Cape by not actually having to fight a battle, but that was impossible. So it ended up in the Battle of Muizenberg, which was fought. This is a beautiful painting done by Johann Federici, which is in our Parliament Library. They got a beautiful extension of paintings and other bits and pieces dating from the period. So Britain was successful. They took the Cape in the 14th of September, 1795, and Craig, the commander, was appointed the first British governor of the Cape, now came face to face with patriotism. Although he was warned about it before he left, he just didn't realize the extent of it, and it became impossible to control it. And the reason mainly for this was the poor to non-existent road infrastructure, and the high mountains that surrounded Cape Town made it absolutely impossible. To get over the pass at Hottentots, Holland was very difficult. It took days to get a wagon over there. So what happened, and this is the most unfortunate part of the whole episode, that in order for Craig to be able to lay his plans and all that, he denigrated the local burgher population. And that curse has remained with us ever since. So it was a problem for Craig, and he did it by trying to run down the Patriots. I'm going on to, you might see and say, gee, how does this fit in? But towards the end, about 1800, there was an idea was formed where Russia was actually abandoning the Allies and he was going to join Napoleon. And this really was a problem because Russia supplied a large portion of the troops that were used in the battles of the Revolutionary War. And obviously it was a problem for Britain. So the first thing they did was to send home Popham to Russia in early 1800 to try and see if they could pull Tsar Paul back and bring him back into the British realm. But unfortunately, Britain at that point in time also then attacked Denmark. And the only way forward for Britain at that point was to attempt the assassination of Napoleon. They attempted that assassination on his way to the Theatre de la République des Arts in the Rue on the 24th of December, 1800. A massive explosion was attempted, but unfortunately, Josephine, Napoleon's wife, held him up long enough so that he didn't arrive at the spot that he needed to. The explosion caused widespread damage in Paris, sorry. But then, after this explosion, Napoleon thought, wait a minute, let me see if I can get back. And he put forward his most dangerous plot that I believe is his most dangerous plot to defeat Britain. And that was the destruction of a maritime trade in the East. So the plan was that Napoleon would use his newfound ally, Russia, the Batavian Republic, in a three-pronged attack to take the Cape and India by a combined land and sea invasion. Now, the land invasion was done by Russia, was done by 21,000 Cossacks. They were due to go through Pakistan and carry on from Russia through and take the upper portion of India. The sea route, the prong was twofold. One, that the Batavian Republic would have 2,400 troops, who the idea was, together with 3,600 troops from France, they would then come and they would take the Cape. And by this method, they could easily overpower Britain, because they couldn't, I mean, they could easily overpower the British forces at the Cape. They never had that number of men here. So Britain was now sitting in a very difficult position. She had absolutely no allies, because most of them now had been defeated by Napoleon. And with the combined forces of France, Batavian Republic, and Russia, it made it impossible for Britain to stop them from taking the Cape and India. Then plans were laid to assassinate Tsar Paul. His son Alexander was already under British influence, and he ultimately would take over the leadership of Russia. So on the night of the 23rd, 24th of March, 1801, 3 men assassinated Tsar Paul. General Bennigsen was one of the assassins. He was in charge of the military. A second by name, a gentleman by the name of Parlin, he was in charge of the military, of the police. And then finally there was a guy called Pannon, who was a great British sympathizer. So in other words, you can see that for Britain it was important. The only way they could do it was to assassinate the leader. And obviously the next day, on the 24th of March, Alexander took over from his father. And immediately all of these plans, because some of them were already on the go, were stopped. To give you an idea, there was the plan from Russia to come through itself via the Cossacks. There was a second seaborne assault that was going to come from a port, which I don't know if its name is correct, but it's called Kamchatka. And that had probably 1,000 men on board, and they were also going to come to India. And of course, as I said to you, the Batavian Republic and France. And then finally, there was an agreement between Russia and Napoleon to work in conjunction with General Messina, a French commander, to also then attack India. So this obviously stopped. The whole thing was then stopped by the assassination of Tsar Paul. This is the front cover of my book, which is the brilliant painting that was done by Estelle. Obviously they came out here. Sorry, I must just get my thing. What had happened was that Henry Addington was in office. He was a weak leader. He was forced to stand down, and the leadership returned to William Pitt. He appointed Lord Melville and Castlereagh to the cabinet, and the 3 men were at that stage worried about increasing Britain's market share in the Spanish South America. So again, we're looking at the South Seas project. General Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan, then approached the British cabinet to ask him to assist to help the South American colonists, but they could not do anything at that point, as Britain was not at war with Spain. But on the 5th of October in that same year, 2 months after all of this, 4 Spanish frigates carrying, I think it was about 3 million pounds of gold and silver from South America were attacked and captured, and that led to a war between Spain and Britain in December. So the plan was then at that point, by the end December 1804, was set for the implementation of Miranda's plan. But at the same time, another thing had occurred, and that was that Britain had made an agreement with Russia to form the Third Coalition, and that they agreed to send 8,000 men in support of the Russian side, and obviously they needed those men, and the Miranda plan was then cancelled. While this was going on, right about mid-June of 1805, a gentleman named Captain Jones arrived from the Cape, and he advised Home Popham that the Cape was weakly defended. But there was also a problem with the Third Coalition agreement, in that Russia was insisting that Malta be returned to the Knights. This Britain could not do it, because they knew that if they did, it would open the door for Napoleon to take Egypt again. But finally, on the 1st of July, 1805, they removed that clause 10, and that impediment then came out. And on the 4th of July, they decided and started to talk about the possibility of reducing the Cape. But they needed to first form military leaders, and they had to be selected and informed. And the second force, which was due to go with Miranda to South America, was stopped, and the attack was diverted to the Cape. The decision to invade the Cape was made on the 24th of July, 1805. There's a very interesting aspect here in that the force left Britain round about the 1st of September, 1805, and just over a month and a half later, Britain gained the complete naval superiority after the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October, 1805. Now, the interesting observation is, if the Battle of Trafalgar had occurred earlier, I wonder if they would have bothered to take the Cape. I'm not sure. But anyway, taking the Cape on the 8th of January ensured Britain's full control of the South and Indian Oceans. And this gave them complete naval superiority in anywhere in the world. And of course, the whole principle of what was happening here, these two events actually laid the foundation for Britain to win the war in Europe. And you might say that sounds odd, but it isn't, because what had happened was Britain needed the finance to finance the Allies in Europe. And it could only be done by the improvement of the Industrial Revolution and by having complete control of the seas, and therefore they could easily, economically overpower any of the European powers. So that is one of the most important reasons for Britain winning the war in Europe. William Pitt, one of the masterminds behind it all, was unfortunately not able to witness the fruit of his hard labor, as he passed away on the 23rd of January, 1806. That is basically the end of my talk, but I just want to show you something which is quite interesting. You know, we talk about the world and its population. This was the beach at Swenningen, which was painted by Adrian van der Velde in 1652. And if you look at it, it is virtually, there's hardly anyone, a couple of boats here and there, but there's hardly anyone else. And then what I did when we were in Holland in 2016, we went down to this beach. This is what it looks like today. And the second one taken from the south, the same spot where Van der Velde was painting his thing, except in this time we're looking at what it looks like out to sea. You got to remember this was winter months, so it was cold. So obviously there weren't people that were swimming, but this gives you an idea of the beach. And that is basically my talk. The Battle of Blaauwberg was fought on the 8th of January, 1806. The British won, the Dutch lost, and the result changed the course of our history. And that's it. I'm open for questions.
Huge thanks, Ian. God, you really opened my eyes to all sorts. Like thinking about the Battle of Trafalgar, that had changed, and Russia. Leslie, are there any comments that have come up or questions? Do you want to unmute?
No questions have come up for the moment, but I'll start with a couple. The Battle of Blaauwberg, I was wondering if you could just give us a sense of how long it was, how many ships were involved coming in, just to give us a brief sense of the Battle of Blaauwberg, how many ships arrived, how long it took, etc.
Okay, there were 61 ships that were involved, okay. nine naval ships and 52 transport ships. They left England on the 1st of September 1805, and they arrived here in the Cape on the 4th of January 1806. So it took them about 3 months, but a lot of the time, they had to do a fair amount of ship repairs in San Salvador. A lot of the ships were dismantled and with heavy wind conditions. So they had to stop over there. And of course, the main important reason was that the planning which had now taken place required that they collect horses. So they arrived here on the 4th. The battle, if they took 2 days, the 6th and the 7th of January, they landed their troops. If you take it from the time the British got up early that next morning, the 8th, and they marched up to Rondekop, and obviously that's when the Batavians saw them. The battle itself lasted less than 1 hour and 15 minutes, if you take the actual battle itself. That is the time when the first shot was fired till when the Batavians retreated. I've got a breakdown of all the times. It's about an hour and 15 minutes maximum. So it wasn't long. I can't hear you, Leslie.
Okay. Thank you. I've now got a question from Ronnie Glass. What was the American role in the European wars after independence in 1776, please?
Well, 2 things. One is that America started to form friendship relationships both with France and Holland. They needed to establish other governments that would recognize them. So the first role they did was obviously to increase their influence in Europe. And they ignored Britain initially, but they did concentrate heavily on Holland. And that's why you find that the patriotic movement started in Holland. And then obviously the overflow went into France, which then started the French Revolutionary War. So in effect, after the American War, their democracy, their whole system of government was very different to what it was in Europe. And obviously the people in Europe were, I would say they were rather annoyed. I wouldn't even call it annoyed. They were rather difficult to control. It led to a lot of riots and other bits and pieces. And I think that you can lay at the door of America, because not that I'm saying it's wrong. I think that they had a new system of government which the people in Europe wanted. So that is the big influence that they had. Afterwards, if you start to talk a bit later, it definitely was the trade. Trade represented a massive means of Britain being able, the USA from being able to gather money and get things together. And obviously you can see it via the trade agreements, how they bypassed them. So obviously they were really looking for a method to gain money, to be able to get their money together without taxing their populace. So that was the big things that America did. And of course, the end result of all of that is the War of 1812, which, as you know, was fought purely for the fact of having trade. They could trade and sail anywhere in the world. So that was the real big bear in the room, I would say.
Okay, and now I have a question also from Roger Stewart. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself so he can ask directly.
Hi, good evening, Ian.
Hi, Roger.
It was clear that the Dutch knew that the Brits were coming, because Janssens interrupted his journey to the east in, I think it was 1805, and arranged for the Waldeck and other troops to come to the Cape to reinforce it. How did that intelligence work? I mean, do you have any details about that?
Yeah, look, a lot of the intelligence that came back was obviously the shipping. You know, when the ships, they had to meet somewhere, neutral ships sailed between various points. The Waldeckers themselves, that was arranged before they came out in 1802. So they weren't going to be reinforced. But what I can tell you is that part of the agreement with the Waldeck Regiment was that they were to return to Europe in 1806, funny enough, and there was a possibility that it could be extended to 1814. So intelligence took a long time to get here. And what Janssens knew basically came from American shipping, merchant shipping, which came along and gave him little tidbits here and there. They didn't know, they knew a force was on their way, but they were never sure how big that force and when it would arrive. They didn't have a clue as to when it did.
No, that's interesting, and thanks very much. Because what was interesting about Janssens was that whoever was still in the Cape Town while he was away, they sent out a soldier to ride by horse and go and find him, and it was quite close to Colesberg, and he rode all the way there to tell Janssens, the Brits, the English are coming, and he interrupted his journey and went all the way back. So I'm just wondering what happened then? What was happening? What was the news in 1805?
Okay, now that is different. Okay, what had happened was that up until when Janssens first arrived in the Cape here in January 1803, there was no war between them, but war was declared a bit later on. And Janssens had gone on to a journey to the east. You're quite right on that score. And while he was on that journey, the message arrived that war had been declared by Britain against Holland in 1803. Britain had declared war on France and Holland in May 1804. So in effect, that is what happened. Is that soldier had to ride all the way out because they knew, and he was near Port Elizabeth as far as I know. And he had then diverted and came back to the Cape, obviously to get things prepared and ready for the possible invasion. But it wasn't the invasion. It was the declaration of war.
Thanks very much.
So now I have another question from Ronnie Glass. I'm going to read it out. Tell us about the Johnston landing here. He landed at Saldanha, as I recall. He's been regarded as a fool who gained his position through influence. Refer Berman and others. Was his campaign successful in any regard?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The problem, I'm not quite sure about Johnson himself. Remember, his original role was to come out here to take the Cape. That was what he was meant to do. But he wasn't a good commander, quite frankly. You know, he had a lot of problems with some of his captains. They weren't happy with dealing with him. But the problem was that battle that occurred in Porter-Praya, and I'll just show you that because it actually is a very interesting aspect. Let me just go back there. If you look at this plan of Porter-Praya, what had happened was these ships here around Point Visconda, they were the 13 merchant ships that had stopped off in the island before Santiago. The rest of them were here, they came out here. But now look at this. You've got all the reinforced ships inside and very little of the defense outside. Both the Rattlesnake, Inferno, and Terror were tiny ships. In fact, Infernal was a fire ship, so it wasn't a ship to which you could fight a battle. Diana was the biggest of the lot, and obviously what had happened is you had hemmed in. All the British ships were hemmed in when Suffren attacked them. So from that perspective, I think he failed because he should have organized two things. One, he should have had the Diana out doing reconnaissance work and coming back, because they were totally surprised when the French arrived. You know, they saw them come around the corner at Picardas Point. Diana was the one ship to see them, and that was the only time. So when they came where this ship Artisan is here, is the first time that they actually spotted the French fleet. So, you know, it was silly of him not to have a frigate out there just keeping an eye on ear while they were doing all their things. And the other thing was they should have had these ships stationed outside here where they could protect the merchant ships. And that was a very silly thing. The other thing is that when he came to attack, he didn't actually come to the Cape, to Saldanha Bay, to attack anyone. But what had happened was a VOC ship called the Held Waldemale had sailed from Saldanha Bay and was caught by 4 British frigates that were actually part of Johnson's fleet, and they caught the ship, and that ship gave them all the information and told them about the other 4 ships that were there within Saldanha Bay. And obviously it was easy for them to attack those 4 ships. They were heavily laden with either goods such as the Middelburg, which had now coming back and had a lot of plate and other stuff on board. So they obviously captured them very easily. And then if you look at the whole thing, the way the attack went and took place, it wasn't done in a real military fashion. It was done in a very different way. He could have actually captured most of the ships, but he didn't. He lost the one, and then when they went, he wasn't actually going to attack the Cape because he knew he couldn't. So he then went back to England, and on the way back to England, they lost 2 of those other ships carrying the goods back. They lost them. I'm not quite sure exactly where. So I don't think Johnson was a very good commander, although he thought he was very good, and he was the informer, like Popham was. He advised the North Cabinet on naval matters, but he wasn't the best, no. Let me put it this way: it was a pure fluke that he took those ships that were in Saldanha. If they hadn't captured the Held Waldemale, they would have not known about it, and they would have just left them. They would have gone back to England. The force that he did have on board, which was with Meadows, would have gone on to reinforce India.
We have more comments. Thank you for that, Ronnie.
So now I'm coming to Greg Andrews' question. Do we know exactly where the hour-long engagement happened?
Yes, we do. Today, we do know exactly where it occurred. I was involved with a search on that battlefield to locate where it was involved. We did an archaeological search, and that search really determined exactly where that line was. I mean, we could possibly pin it down to within 50 meters. The British side is very easy because the maps are very clear as to where they are. The Dutch side, unfortunately, on current maps, show it in the incorrect position. But yes, we do know exactly where it took place. And Dave can tell you that too. He should be able to add a bit there. Dave, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, no, it's very easy to pick up where all the action took place, and but as you say, the work that Willem Hutton did on the archaeological side, identifying positions on the battlefield, it's almost down to, you can stand there, you get the full fill on the battlefield, exactly where you stand. You knew there was men standing there in 1806, and I think just going on from that, Ian, in your book, you describe the action that happened on Kleinburg, which tends to get overlooked, I think, on a lot of the other books that have been written about the Battle of Blaauwberg. But that's really brought home that early action in the early part of the morning, how the British advanced and how Kleinburg became important in the outcome of the battle.
Yeah, David, was important for the simple reason that he wasn't sure what was behind those dunes. And that's why I think it's so important for people to actually go onto the battlefield to get a feel for what those dunes are like. What you got to accept is Janssens was 40 meters lower than the British forces, or 45, I think it was. And, he couldn't, even sitting on his horse, he couldn't see over the dunes. It was impossible. So he actually didn't see the British regiments where they were, or the 1st Brigade. He saw the other brigade. The 2nd Brigade was very clear and visible to him, but not the others. So the advance of the 24th Grenadiers was not known, and wasn't known by him. He didn't see it. But I think that the Hottentot Corps, which was stationed on Kleinburg, did manage to get the message across. But the problem was he wasn't sure how big that force was. He had no idea. And that's why he sent the 2 guns, which was the downfall of his defense.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, I think it's just unfortunate the battlefield at the moment. The sand dune section is totally covered in Port Jackson. If they could clear that lot out, it would be much clearer if you stand in the Batavian position, and you'll get a better understanding if you could clearly see where all those sand dunes are lined up.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial that the Port Jackson is taken out, because you can't get a feel for it. You know, it's only because I've walked on it. You know, every blooming piece of square meter on that place that I walked in, you understand what it looks like and feels like. And in some of those areas, when you're in amongst the dunes, you can't see anything. You know, you just see the dunes around you, and that's it.
Yeah, correct.
And let me tell you, they were white. It was hot. So I don't think it was fun. And obviously they didn't know where they had good water, because the English had taken the only water that they had was, I think, 3 pints. So you can imagine having to fight all day long. You couldn't use not all day long, sorry, that's wrong, but having to walk all day long and having the 3 pints with you, and that was it, because you couldn't drink the water at Blaauwberg's Vlei. It was too salty or brackish. So it was impossible to drink.
Yeah.
And that's why I think they struggled, you know, to get down to Rietvlei, where they saw water that night. I mean, they were grateful, I think, for that water.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I actually I'll just put a comment through on the chat line just to mention that one of the biggest things I think out of your book that really enhances the book is the paintings. And obviously behind you at the moment is the Justinus Keir's outspan, which became the field hospital. And that painting, from looking on the computer, it looks like a photograph. It's a fantastic painting.
Yeah, you must thank Estelle. Estelle is a brilliant artist. I mean, she really did a marvelous job. But I must also point out something else to you, just talking about the water situation. What most people don't realize is the Cape was suffering a heavy drought at that point in time as well. So there wasn't a lot of surface water around. It was a real major problem, both for Janssens. Janssens is very clear in his documentary evidence that, you know, where he was, they were running out of water. They needed to get out of that battle or out of that area as soon as possible. They had another day or so, and they had to get out. So, you know, people don't realize the impact of this drought on that battle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I've got 2 more questions from Ronnie Glass. Saffron, also not highly regarded. He waited for reinforcements instead of attacking Johnston. And he would like to know if the battlefield is protected from development yet.
Okay, to answer the first one, I don't believe that Saffron was a bad commander. I personally think he was a good commander. The point is that he sailed into a very difficult situation. Bear in mind that if you look at the map, which is still up on the screen there, he attacked immediately. He knew that the British were there. The Artisan had actually come around, had seen the British ships, and then gone back and warned him that there was a problem. But what is most important is the wind direction. If you look at the wind direction here, if it was blowing from any other quarter, he couldn't attack. It was blowing in the absolutely right quarter for him to be able to attack those things and get out. Where I think he came a bit unstuck was that I don't think his men that were fighting on the ships were that good in terms of their firing. I don't think they were accurate, because how Johnson's guys managed to dismast one of the ships is now something else. The other problem that he had, and it's not his fault really, and that is the Vengier, which is up here. It was 3 miles behind, and it would have taken them a long time to get it. So he had a choice. he either could wait in this area for that ship to come up, and if he did that, the wind would have blown him out into the open and the British would have seen him. So I think the point is he had to attack with only 3 ships and not the other 2, because the other 2 were still further behind in this. So really, I don't think he was a bad commander. I think he did very well when you go to India and see what he did in India. I think he did extremely well there. Now I've forgotten what the second question was. It wasn't.
I'll just come back to you because Ronnie's just made another comment. I refer to Suffren while he was at the Cape with his fleet, but interesting. And his second question was whether the battlefield is protected from development.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is. But unfortunately, like anything else in our country, anything metal is subject to being stolen. And I think they have a real problem in trying to keep people out in terms of losing the fencing. But yes, I think it is well protected at this point in time. I do not see it as an issue. It is proclaimed as a nature reserve, and as well it's a protected site. So I think there's not much more that one can do. The only thing that I would like to see is more development. That unfortunately, that the site is so inaccessible even today. If Parkview or Parklands is coming up slowly, and they're not far behind now, but there's no access to that site, and that's really a pity. The view from Grootberg or Blaauwberg itself is absolutely magnificent. On the right day at the right time, that place, where in the world would you see 2 heritage sites in one view? And it's beautiful. So yeah. Does that answer your question, Ronnie?
I had the question from Roger Stewart, and I just want to check if it's been answered. He asked where the exact battle was. I don't know if that was answered.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Ian, where exactly? Could you just describe it for those of us who haven't been to it yet?
Okay. To go, just unfortunately, I don't have a map here which I could quickly draw to show you. But effectively, what happens if it is fought on the eastern side of Grootberg and Kleinberg? So in other words, it's on the eastern side. There is approximately about 1 kilometer of sand dunes that you get from when you go from Grootberg to where it reaches Blaauwberg Valley. You have these dunes. It's about 1 kilometer. And then the valley itself is plus minus about 300 to 400 meters wide. And it then starts to go into another fairly large sand dune area, which is not protected. It's outside the battle. So the battle was in this Blaauwberg Valley. I don't know, how can I best describe them? It is 1 kilometer in from, a bit more than 1 kilometer in from Blaauwberg Hill, the big hill. And on the eastern side. That's about as best that I can describe it. The other way to look at it is if you travel on the route from Melkbosstrand and you go towards the N7, as you start to leave, there's a farm called Blaauwberg. And if you then turn and look to your right, you will see 3 very low koppies. And the one on the right, as you're looking at it, that's Rondekop. And that is approximately where, on the other, a bit more further east of that would be where the battle would be if you draw a line. Other than that, the only way I can do this is, I wonder if I can possibly, I'll have to look up something here to get it
It's
out.
fine.
But I can
conscious
see you
of time. We're coming up to 6. I think this shows we'll have to have a visit. We'll have to have a tour when Dave Honor is back.
You have to go to the site to understand it. I mean, really, it's without a question, you can then begin to get a feel for the battlefield.
Ian, maybe you could send me a map that I could include when I email around to everyone, a link to the recording early next week.
Okay, just hang on a sec. I'll tell you what, I just realized I've got my book here. What I'll do. I'm just going to pop it up here quickly for you.
Okay, well, we need to finish, and of course, please feel free to email me, and I can forward them to Ian. Any burning issues before we finish? Oh yeah, we can. It's a bit hard to see, Ian.
No, okay, all right. Then I can't show it to you, but that's, yeah, okay, don't worry.
and do let me know if there's anything else. Ian, your knowledge is phenomenal. The way you have researched this and can remember all the dates, not just of what happened in Blaauwberg, but also Russia, France, Holland, the States, and of course Britain. And I'm so thrilled your book is doing well. If anybody wants, you've got 2 copies left. They're 1,500.
That's correct.
Can you just finish up on that?
Yeah, the book is 1,000. Let me just show you the book. This is the front cover. I don't know if you can see. Unfortunately, with all the light, it might not be great.
Yeah, we can see it.
It's a very nice book. It's fairly thick, as you can see. It's A4 size. It's going for 1,500 Rand, and I do have 2 copies available for sale. If people are interested, they can just get hold of me. I don't know how long I'm going to have them for, because I'm giving the same talk in a couple of days' time, and those guys most likely would take the remaining 2. So I don't know, but if you do get in early or not, and this is not to try and force people to make a decision, it's just when people see the book, they buy it. That is the situation that I've seen. And you saw some of the comments on the book.
Yeah, go well done to you and Barbara and Estelle and the team.
Yeah, I think you must rather say the team, not me.
Well, we look forward to future collaborations. And I just had a phone call from someone who thought it was 6 o'clock and they want another one. But Ian, I take my hat off to you and the team, particularly to do this Zoom, because I don't think you'd ever done it before. And
no,
I really admire it. It's a bit stressful even for me who've done a few. Thank you for being up for it, and thank you all for tuning in from wherever you are in the world. And you certainly opened my eyes to the political shenanigans internationally that led to what you believe is the most significant battle in this country's history. And it remains me to say, on the 11th of the 11th, think of battles everywhere and those that are still continuing. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Kate. I've enjoyed the talk as well. Sorry, there are times when it didn't quite go the way I'd like it to have gone, but anyway.
It was super.
You're right. When you do a Zoom talk for the first time, there's a lot of lessons to be learned as well.
You did brilliantly. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the people who listened and everything else. And I trust that you all are satisfied.
And I'd like to thank Leslie Cox too for brilliant moderating and for introducing me to Ian in the first place, and the fabulous walking tours you do in town and the waterfront, as well as your voluntary work for the fabulous Simon van der Stel Foundation. Any burning questions and thanks? Otherwise, good night.
Good night, Kate.
Night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.